to start places that built us. I'm very conscious. We are in a shared space. If you are browsing, browse away happily, browse away quietly. There are stalls to have wee chats at down in the snug. If you are upstairs, we ask you to just take the literature and then talk to them after the event, just so that everyone who's in the front bit gets to enjoy the event. So I'll remind you at the end about the quiet browsing. I'm going to introduce Jess, who is our chair for today's event. But before I do that, I have some apologies. Poor Dalia couldn't be with us today, but has sent us some recordings. So we're going to be threading that into the conversation from the screen up above. Bear with me. I am not a tech wizard, but we're going to do our best. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jess, and then Jess will take us into the event. Jessica Gaitán Johannesson is a writer and organizer based in Edinburgh. She's the author of the Desmond Elliott Prize-nominated novel, How We Are Translated, and the essay collection, one of my all-time favorites, The Nerves and Their Endings, Essays on Crisis and Response. She's the program director of Edinburgh's Radical Book Fair, although currently on parental leaves, and a member of Fossil Free Books, a collective of book workers organizing for an industry free of fossil fuel finance and profits from human rights abuses. Will you join me in welcoming Jess and Aileen?
Now it's there with its friends, where it belongs. This is so wonderful. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, I'm Jess, and it's really, really wonderful to see so many of you here today. I've not been to the book fair yet this year, and it looks like it's just going wonderfully. So kudos, Myri, you're doing an amazing job. Yay! So just a few words about the title of this particular event, Places That Built Us. So the idea behind it is really kind of a dream conversation, to be honest, because this is the kind of stuff that I just walk around thinking about all the time. And it's really, really wonderful to be here talking to you all and to you about it. So when we organize for climate and environmental justice, which is an inherently anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle, this kind of demands a quite expansive lens, right? We need to look at the close by and the very local, and the far away and the global at the same time. And I think that often asks questions about where does our responsibility lie? Where do we belong? What does connection to land and connection to place actually mean? Which are huge, huge questions, and we're going to answer them all today. We're going to dip in a little bit, is what we're going to do, and mainly kind of offer ways in, and it's a conversation that we'll probably continue to have the rest of our lives, probably. So before we start the conversation, as Myri mentioned, Dalia couldn't be here today, so we've got a little bit of input on video. But I'm going to introduce our two speakers, first of all. So we've got Aileen Angsutorn, who is a Thai-British writer, photographer, and artist based in Aperture, whose work centres social justice and climate justice. She has written for Shadow Magazine, The Courier, Bella Caledonia, Migrant Women Press, and National Trust for Scotland, among others. She is the founder of Decolonising the Outdoors. The zine part of that project is right there. A creative and community project which dismantles narratives and dominating land and extracting nature and imagines anti-capitalist decolonial futures. An applause for Aileen, and thank you for being with us today. Hi. We've also got Dalia Al-Dujaili, who's an Iraqi-British writer, editor and producer based in London. She is the online editor of the British Journal of Photography. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Dazed, GQ, WePresent, Aperture, Atmos, It's Nice That, Elephant Art, and more. She's the founder of the Road to Nowhere magazine, and in 2023, she was the producer of Refugee Week. Dalia holds an MA honours in English literature from the University of Edinburgh. She was really excited to come back as well, just because she used to live here as well. So it would have been really nice, but it is also an honour to have her here over video. So we're going to start just by sort of setting the scene a wee bit by talking about the project, Decolonising the Outdoors. So I was going to ask you, Aileen, to introduce the project a wee bit and just how it connects to different aspects of this idea of belonging to land or belonging to a place or several places, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jess. So there's many sort of strands to decolonising the outdoors. It's creative and it's a community project, and interweaves different threads really, because it's quite a big topic. It started last year from my disillusionment in the conservation sector, and I think we'll be talking a bit about that in the session today. And it's as a way to sort of challenge the dominant narratives around land and nature being a commodity, something that's extracted from and something that is separate to humans. And sort of done that through different work, through art, through the zine, but also through events. And through these events, particularly with BIPOC communities, we explore what does it mean to build or rebuild connections with our natural environment, particularly where these have been fractured because of displacement and migration. I think that the belonging, or maybe a lack of belonging, or we'll explore whether we want to belong, definitely plays a part of that.
Brilliant. So I was going to start off our conversation by asking a huge question to both you and to Dalia, and we've got Dalia's answer on video. And the question is, because obviously this idea of belonging, and you mentioned the word fractured there, is really complex for many of us, and not exclusively, but partly due to migration. So I wanted to just start probing a little bit into the question by asking, how does migration, in your case, kind of define your idea of environmental justice, really? And let's start with you, and then we'll bring in Dalia over video afterwards. Yeah.
So I think, this is a really big question, and I think something that's quite funny is the way that migration is cherry-picked in different narratives when it comes to environmental justice. So when we talk about work in the UK, there's a very nationalistic feel around conservation, around nature, around what our environment should look like. But that isn't necessarily very present when we talk about global impact of environmental policy, of the impact of polluting global north countries in the global south countries, which is still seen as a very extractive, transactional, it's part of industrialization and globalization. So I think it's quite tricky when it's quite a warped narrative, I think, on how migration is talked about, depending on the context.
And there's a few things to kind of pick up there, I think. Let's see what Dalia has to say, and then we'll kind of bring it back, both of your answers together. So should we have just the first two videos there?
Hi everyone, my name is Dalia Al-Dujaili. I'm the author of Babylon Albion. I'm so sorry I can't be with everyone in person this afternoon at what I hope is a very enriching and nourishing conversation. I will be just giving a short reading from Babylon Albion, and I hope this excerpt kind of shapes and contextualizes my answers to some of the brilliant questions that I've been asked. So this section is from the 4th chapter, Common Ground, and it kind of gives
Bear with us, we received it in 4 different files. And we've tried to sort of...
So I actually end that section by asking the question, so do my mother's and father's memories become my own? Are they imprinted into the landscape of my body and mind in the same way a foot leaves its print in the mud, or a once flowing river leaves behind a deep, dry ravine? Gestures of movement persist in the landscape. So what I've tried to do in those sentences is illustrate the ways in which movement not only shapes a body and a memory and an inheritance through generations of families, but also how movement literally, physically shapes the land beneath our feet, how the movement of a river leaves behind a ravine, how the movement of a person through a footpath leaves behind an imprint in the mud. And these gestures of movement and these imprints in the landscape and in the body, they persist, and they ask us to question the role of migration and movement in the environment around us and within our own families and within our own lineages. And I hope it illustrates the necessary nature of movement.
Right. So, huge questions. I mean, one of the things that Dalia kind of really talks about in her book is that what was mentioned there, like the necessity of movement and the fact that migration is something really natural everywhere, but that it, in certain narratives and certainly in terms of the nation state, it becomes an anomaly. But you mentioned there just before also how you mentioned the word cherry picking. I'm kind of wondering if we can talk a little bit about how migration can also be sort of co-opted within like a kind of globalization narrative, and like the certain types of migration fine and others not. Is there anything there that you sort of want to bring in or sort of go a bit deeper into? What comes to mind is I'm always fascinated with the differentiation between migrant and expat, which is essentially the same thing, and who's afforded those different terms, and what that means in terms of expectations on a migrant or an expat to integrate, to speak another language, to what does that mean? And I think that something that Dalia also mentioned around memory also really resonates in terms of our experiences of migration, how we have our connections to topography, to climate, and when that changes significantly, how does that impact our sense of belonging to a place, particularly where there's trauma around forced displacement and migration as well. And I think something that I've been wanting to perhaps move away from personally is having a sense of belonging, and not because I don't feel like it's something that for me is it's not a fixed thing. It's something that's transient, that's adaptive and expansive, and maybe I don't necessarily want to belong to a specific place. But yeah, I think I just moved on a little bit from that. No, totally. and I feel like that, for me, that really resonates. I remember saying to somebody at some point that, like, I'm really bad with place. And particularly maybe in terms of writing, that there's so much talk about, like, writing about place and having a sense of place. And I've always been a bit like, what is that, Identity and belonging comes from so many different things, not necessarily just place, which kind of brings me a little bit to something else that I wanted to ask you about. So, again, actually in Dalia's book, but it definitely comes across in parts of the zine as well in terms of community projects, there's a difference maybe between knowledge and knowing. The knowledge, the way that it's often presented within science, for example, has very has had colonial frameworks and imperial frameworks, and is very exclusive of what is defined as knowledge about the non-human world, whereas there are many, many types of knowing. So I was really curious to hear about what kind of kinds of knowing sort of emerged to you while working in this project with different communities? If there's any of them that you want to share.
It's definitely it's the need to prioritise community knowledge and have also to expand that by removing barriers that are afforded only to academia, to institutions, like funding, like resources and tools, to different community projects. I think that this is, I guess, the backdrop and the context in which we look at nature and natural environment and conservation, which is this top-down approach where the experts are typically from global north organisations and institutions who will conduct helicopter research in the global south, either consulting with or extracting from local communities with no ongoing benefit to those communities. And I mean, that also can be expanded to the way that academia works anyway, and how we see research, and how environmental policy is developed in the world of science. So that is a very that is a very also colonial way of thinking about who is an expert and sort of who has that knowledge. And I think opening this up to be more of a bottoms-up approach or community-centred approach is what is needed, and what a lot of these projects and initiatives are doing, like some of the ones I mentioned in the zine, but give more power and agency back to the people, particularly because it will help in feeling more empowered through the climate crisis as well. And a lot of that is also recovering lost knowledge, because many of us might have that throughout generations or through our own experience and knowledge that you have when you're doing something yourself. I mean, that's all lived experience, is all valid. Yeah,
and I guess we should say as well that that top-down approach, it's also present even like with local communities, like in Scotland. It's community knowledge there is also like ignored and excluded from the conversation, I suppose.
Yes, who gets the funding? It's the institutions who will get the funding, and they'll say, well, we'll do something, we'll co-create with the community. Yeah. But then what's your interaction with the community? Is it a one-off process as part of being able to develop your paper? I mean... which is a very extractive process. Yeah. It's very, very little giving and much taking.
One thing so there's a really powerful piece in the zine about, well, essentially like the inherent racism and a lot of conservationism in the UK, which I would really like to explore a little bit. For me, the way in, I mean, I was reading it as I was thinking a lot about even the way that I was kind of phrasing my questions. So I found myself using words such as like, this question is rooted in, and even the word belonging, right? The fact that we use the word belonging to a place, which is the same word that we use for ownership, is really interesting to me. And obviously that can be used and has been used in really extractive frameworks and for colonial agendas. But in terms of the language that we use to describe, or that is often used to describe natural landscapes, and how that has played into visions of like a pure landscape, an untouched landscape, very often like nationalist agendas in terms of purity and in terms of just, white nationalism, really. What kind of role does the way that we talk, the words we use, have in challenging like the racism within this work, the work of conservation and the work of just like taking care of the environment? And what role does storytelling have in that? How can we use language and stories to challenge that sort of co-opting of language, if that makes sense? Does that make sense as a question? Yeah.
I think, as you mentioned, I want to go a bit deeper into like the context in which we talk about land, because
Yeah, please do.
that really is the backdrop to the way we talk about it now and our approach. Because sometimes is it just the terminology we use? Yes, but also who's using it and what's the context we're using it in, what does it actually mean? And I think, land is a commodity and it's embedded in our society. It's something that you own, that you procure. It's divided, it's bordered. You have to seek permission for what you can and cannot do with land. So conservation, to me, is a colonial solution to a colonial problem. In many, societies and cultures where land is seen as communal, is seen as part of the identity, indigeneity, there isn't a need for this concept around conservation, because you're not protecting something that's separate. So when we talk about the green, I can't remember the quote now, but the pleasant green land, with the nationalist quote in English, and about England, and also the Zionist quote around making the desert bloom. These are all around sort of visions of what people should be doing with their land, and if they're not harnessing it in a way that's producing the most economic benefit. We've seen that with the Highland clearances, where crofters on communal land were cleared from their land because of for capitalist reasons. So I think that does seep into what conservation is today when we talk about rewilding, when we talk about different species being native, not native, invasive, and because what does it mean for those species? It means that they have to be eradicated, and that's like not an accidental terminology either, and that sort of that approach. So it's very hostile. It's very, it's still very much a vision. It is someone's vision of what should and should not be here, and that is often means a separation, national parks, national reserves, which also means clearing people and communities from that land. How do we, rather than seeing that we need to live with nature, we are guardians of nature, and how do we have that infrastructure that's really embedded? So I think that part of storytelling, or part of what the zine does, what the project does, is to unpick these narratives, to challenge what these narratives are, in order to help people understand, or to help people feel more, let's say, connected, if we don't want to say belonging, more connected to each other, to each other as people, and to this earth, as opposed to in a possessive way over the land.
And something else that obviously it's related to that, and you talk about in that piece is, what does that then mean for people who come into the work of conservation? Or if we're expanding that, there's been so many times working in climate justice groups and climate justice movements where, even if the framework is specifically about climate justice and mentions that it is inherently anti-racist and that it is about really tackling the root problem of the climate crisis. There's so many times when I've spoken to other people of color who just I don't feel welcome. I don't feel like I belong in this movement. I don't feel like there's a barrier there. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that as well. What are the big shifts that need to happen in terms of, for it not to be a question of inviting people into an existing, this is the work that we're doing and we want you to come in, rather than but instead it being defined by a huge variety of people, which is really about accessibility in the wide sense. But yeah, are there any kind of learnings that you've come across in terms of just talking to people and doing this work with the project?
Yeah, I think to also put into context, conservation is the second most white sector in the UK. So it's kind of unsurprising that there is that sentiment when people try to be part of it. I think part of the issue is there's systems thinking, whereas why is conservation separate to social justice, to migrant justice? These are all things that are connected. So often people will go to grassroots movements and groups that recognise the interconnectedness of these struggles, because that's where they see themselves seen, and really that's where I think the future is in terms of having more, it's more power to the people and democratic control in community-led and community-centred work, which we're not seeing at this, at an institutional level. And that's something that I see with the people that I've spoken to in the zine, the people who come to my events as well, and also why I created Decolonise Outdoors in the first place, because if you don't see the spaces where you feel that you're welcome, then people create their own. So, yeah, I think that's...
Is there also an aspect that often gets overlooked as my leading question, just in terms of class, and in terms of who the interlinking of all of those types of exclusion, like who has the ability, or who has the time, or who has the space in their lives and the access to get involved with things like this, and to care for environment, however you may define that.
I think that's something that's interesting when we look at access to green and blue spaces. And Scotland is supposed to fare relatively well in terms of 3/4 of all people living in cities and towns are within a 10-minute walk to a green space. But then it's, what is that green space, and what does that mean? How can people engage with it? When you've got such a high proportion of private land ownership in Scotland, that only 4% of all green spaces in Scotland are public parks. You have about 9%, which is sports spaces, which you'd like to think are like tennis courts and things, but no, the majority are golf courses. And it's things like allotments and community growing spaces only account for 1% of all green spaces. So in terms of having that access, okay, you maybe have access to see a tree, but what does that mean in terms of starting to share knowledge around how you can share seeds and grow different plants and grow them also in your flat, on the windowsill. I think there is a lot of focus on access to nature being for rural communities, and as you mentioned, it was wealthy white people who also have the time, who are retired, who can have the time to do that. So I think there are groups out there, and there should be more, obviously, funding and support for those initiatives which encourage this in an urban space, and for people from different backgrounds, specifically understanding around culturally appropriate food, which is something that's often missing around narratives of, well, we need to eat locally. I've always found that quite a ostracizing, as in that doesn't necessarily include me, because that doesn't really include Thai food in that eat locally, because so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand how to connect different people and engage different people in that way.
Yeah, I was going to say as well that I really want us to mention lots of, like, specifically the work that is being done and the different groups that we've come across and worked with. So we'll try to do that, and especially towards the end. But there's also, it's in the zine and it's in Dalia's book, and there's ask us basically, and we'll try to lift those up as much as we can. Going back to, I guess, drawing on this idea of diversity in terms of how you define a natural environment, or like different understandings of that in the first place. I wanted to ask you about, so there's a beautiful piece in the zine about queer ecologies, which is a huge topic, as we were saying back in the green room, and there's books written about it, and we're not going to go into it in depth, but more in terms of how it connects to the idea of belonging or not wanting to belong, because it's really striking when you start thinking about within the framework of queer ecologies that, like, if you as a queer person walk through life feeling like you don't belong in a heteronormative society, how radical isn't it to think with the reality that the vast majority of the world is queer. Yeah. Essentially, that the natural world is queer, that there is that sexual diversity in the natural world. What kind of possibilities does that present, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, queer ecologies is decolonizing, because you're challenging the binary, the norm, you're queering your understanding of nature and the natural world, but also, yes, I mean, nature is queer. Every time I see like another like TikTok or something around a wildlife organization having observed something between a same-sex pair of birds that are raising this chick, oh, it's so unusual. I'm like, well, it's not. But you think it's unusual because of the what's ingrained in terms of the heteronormativity around nature. And I think this, I mean, it is also related to what a colonial approach is. It's inserting these assumptions onto the world around us, and then being very surprised when they're and thinking this is an anomaly when it happens, and in many circumstances as well has actually been written off as an anomaly and then not understood as being commonplace for decades. So I think we have great people who are doing work, queer ecologists in this space, and I think having more of that and seeing more of that in across Scotland and the UK would be great.
Absolutely. Can I check how we're doing on time? Because I'm terrible. Brilliant. Fantastic. I just want to make sure that we've got plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question that's sort of half-formed in your brain at this point, hold on to that, and we'll open up for questions in a bit. And we've got another video from Dalia as well to come in. I wanted to sort of switch over to talking a little bit more about the different groups that you've worked with and that we've worked with, and the kind of ongoing work that really needs more space and that needs support and that we want to see growing. The theme for the whole book fair is ecosystems of change, and I guess where that came from in our sort of original discussions around it was the need for cross-movement coalitions, really. It's the understanding that in order for actual change to happen, the kind of change we so desperately need, no one movement and no one issue is going to achieve that. But it's the real possibility is the real possibility emerges when you've got different movements coming together and finding that actually the issues are intertwined, like you were saying. And one of them that I sort of wanted to bring up a little bit is actually between the climate justice movement and migrant rights movement. So, for example, you've got different groups working for divestment, which are calling for divestment from the border industrial complex and from fossil fuels at the same time. And obviously that's really, really powerful. What sort of possibilities do you see in terms of those, like the bigger sort of movements coming together and working alongside each other? Not necessarily in a kind of static way, as in like, let's form a new group, but more like, it makes sense to work together here on this thing, and then we work with somebody else next week because it's ever evolving, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the groups I spoke to in the zine include the Washhouse Garden in Glasgow, who are queer-led, Community Garden, and Lauriston Farm in Edinburgh, who are a community cooperative farm, and also Glasgow Seed Library are in there too. Although I'm not sure if they are still around. But they are very much, they spoke to me also around the international peasant movement, of which they are part of, which is a coalition of, I think it's 180 local and national organisations in 81 countries, representing 200 million peasants. So we're talking about landless workers, migrant workers, indigenous people, small and medium-sized farmers, rural women and youth, who advocate for food sovereignty, which is the right to access healthy and sustainably, grown, culturally appropriate food, and that encompasses so many different things. It encompasses indigenous rights, land rights, migrant rights, divestment from fossil fuels, divestment from weaponry and war and genocide. So it really feels like, they've been doing a lot of work at UN level as well, but having that as a global movement, which is made up of lots of other sort of organisations and people and individuals as well, really feels like the work they've been doing over the last 30 years is really pushing, I think, and bringing to the forefront how some of these issues are interconnected, but also trickling that down at a local level as well. But you've also been working with organisations.
I think one of the challenges, I suppose, is in that it can sometimes feel like people want the simplicity of siloing.
Yeah.
And that maybe one of the challenges in doing that kind of work is how you communicate it, so that you don't have to spend a lot of time constantly explaining what do migrant rights have to do with, or what does Palestine have to do with climate, for example. And I think that is kind of one of the big challenges maybe ahead, like for a lot of groups and a lot of organizations, in that how do you sort of communicate that to people? And maybe the answer is in a lot of different ways, depending on who you're talking to, as with all communications. I don't know if you agree with that, or how,
Yeah, definitely. So I used to be a policy professional, so my policy hat on, would be definitely depends on who you're talking to, and it's like what are your main asks as well. So it's prioritizing depending on what particular issues coming up, what bill is getting put forward. So I think it needs to be dynamic, I think, in terms of understanding that too.
I mean, the example of talking about Palestine and talking about climate is a really poignant one, obviously. Do you feel like that's kind of getting through on a larger scale, that people sort of get why those issues are interlinked, or is that still like a one that we have to sort of keep hammering in, if that makes sense?
I think, that's a really weighted question. I think that the issue we have is at state level. So I think it's, obviously there's an individual level as well. It's very difficult to know how many people understand that, particularly when you're in different circles. If we're talking about the people in this room, I'm sure we don't need to explain that. But I think that what we're struggling with is a constant, the rise of fascism and the rise of state surveillance and suppression keeps pushing back as these movements keep getting louder and keep gaining traction. So my sort of question is, how do we combat that when you're supposed to have elected a government that was supposed to have been more progressive on some of these issues, has done a complete 180 now that they're in power. So I think that's the challenge, is in how do we defeat or bring down global powers? Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're absolutely right in that it really depends on who you're talking to. Absolutely. But I think at the same time, because I'm also thinking within movements that maybe see themselves as progressive. Like a few years ago, I think you would still walk into a lot of like spaces that were maybe climate activism spaces or like environmentalist spaces, and there would be quite little understanding of those interlinked issues. And I guess the hopeful part of me thinks that that has by necessity changed, which might be worth something, but at least like a step in the way. But yeah, I don't know if you have, what's your take on that in those spaces, in like conservation spaces or?
I think there's still some way to go in terms of connecting the different struggles. And I personally still struggle in majority white spaces, even if, for a variety of reasons. So I think, putting it that way, I think there's some ways to go.
Oh, definitely. I agree. Absolutely. I think we should give a bit more space to like talk about different groups that people should go and check out. So we're going to bring in another video from Dalia, talking about some of the work that's mentioned in her book.
So the next question is about environmental justice work that I find powerful. And of course, I'm going to pick all the people that I interviewed in Babylon Albion. I spoke to many incredible, very powerful, vital people that are working in environmental justice. So Ali Al-Zain is one of those people. He is a Syrian refugee that arrived in the UK when he was 18 years old, roughly. And he started Bees and Refugees, which is an organization that teaches refugees, newly arrived people, how to beekeep. So what ends up happening is that these newly arrived people from places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, they actually have employable skills, and they're able to sell the bee huts, I'm not sure what they're called, hives, bee huts, and they're able to be employed at local businesses. Another person is Jassim Al-Asadi. So Jassim Al-Asadi, along with a few other people in Iraq, he founded Nature Iraq, which is an organization that predominantly works in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is in the north, but also in Basra and in the marshes, which are in the south of Iraq. And Nature Iraq focuses on, obviously, preservation of the natural environment in Iraq. Iraq is the fourth most vulnerable country to climate change in the world, and it really is facing currently desertification, which means the desertification of a place, it becoming desert, and consistently facing really damning droughts. Okay, Flock Together. So they're a group in the UK that focus on black and brown, or let's say POC, people of colour, bird watching. And they take groups of young POC people out into nature to go on long hikes, and they give them binoculars and they teach them how to bird watch. And it's one of the most powerful community building exercises I've witnessed. So they are very important. I wish I could talk about them more, but I don't want to take up too much time. The last person, I've got a list of people here that I want to mention, but the last person I'll mention is Miriam Rose. So Miriam Rose inherited the Hardwick estate, and I interview all these people in the book and I talk about their work extensively, but Miriam Rose inherited the Hardwick estate in just outside of Reading. And the estate, obviously she grew up on the estate and ended up inheriting it, but it was built by her great-grandfather, who was responsible for building the railroads in many places, including Australia, and it decimated Canada and Australia, and it decimated indigenous populations in those regions. So actually, and coal mining as well. So actually, Miriam ended up becoming, ironically, a anti-mining activist, and she is in the process of handing over her estate with her brother to kind of public ownership. So the local village or villages surrounding the estate will be legally the owners of the land collectively. So it's kind of this co-op, inspired by this idea of a co-op. That takes years to implement through kind of legislation, I'm assuming, but also it's a really difficult thing to do, to understand how you hand over a piece of land to a community. I think it's never been done before in the UK. I think it's the first estate that's going to be legally recognised as community owned or publicly owned. So this draws in obviously a lot of questions around like how does a community take responsibility for something like a huge piece of land? What do they do with it? They're already doing amazing work on the estate, which you can read about in the book. But that is someone I really want to mention.
All the videos have really abrupt endings, but yeah, that was really great hearing about, and it kind of made me think of what you were saying earlier about the top-down approach of like extracting information about land and about place from communities, and then using that in whether it be for legislation or academia, rather than the opposite. Have you come across, or do you have any examples of like that opposite that you'd like to mention in terms of actual communities defining how to not to mention belonging, but how to take care of and care with a place?
Yeah, I mean the groups that I interviewed. So the Washhouse Garden in Glasgow and Lauriston Farm in Edinburgh. There are also many more, community gardens and community farms that you can find in your local area as well. But they stewarding the land, and through cooperatives, through a non-hierarchical approach. So that's very much part of what they do, and they give back to the community as well. So as well as doing activities, workshops and support and opportunities for communities to get involved. It's very much what does the community want to see? What do you want to grow? How do we share that knowledge of growing and understanding, and having nutritious food that has travelled, or not travelled very many miles, food that you can't find in the supermarket, but is really delicious. So that's a lot of what they do, and is the part of the ethos, as well as looking after the, growing in a eco-friendly, environmentally friendly way, using the principles of agroecology. And I think these are really, this is really great work that they're doing, but there's not enough funding and support for community groups, for community-owned land. I think we're at 3% of Scotland is community-owned land. So you have like the Isle of Egg. Is it Egg or Eig? Egg. Isle of Egg, who own their own island. The community own them. I think it's like 1997 they bought it out, and they came back in the news relatively recently because they pledged to PACB as an island as well. And we have like the land reform bill, that was passed recently, which is supposed to tackle some of that inequality in land, but like it doesn't. Lots of people are saying that it's not really going far enough, in terms of it's only on sale of, when there's a transaction in place, so a sale of an estate that's larger than 1,000 hectares, but then it has to go for like minister approval. Okay, so then we're putting the power and the decision back to the government, who say, we'll give the opportunity for communities to buy it out. Okay, with what money? So where does this, that's part of the issue. And some of these, groups, they obviously don't own the land that they steward. So there's a precariousness and a risk that, the people who own the land will then say, actually, we're going to sell it because we're going to develop it.
Taken away any time.
Yeah, because it's going to be more of a profit now. Yeah. So they've told me as well there's not enough support from councils in terms of, funding and grants to community enterprises and cooperatives also. So I think there's a lot of different interlinking parts.
Yeah, and what kind of crops up for me there as well is that it can be, as long as the sort of ownership still lies with, I guess, people in power or the people with the money, there is a risk of just handouts, of just like using it as a kind of charity type exercise or something that looks good, rather than it actually handing over, like the power lies with the community, right?
Yeah, and I think there's this, again, it's around like control and who's seen as, who's seen as being able to have agency over the land. As, if governments and institutions think, well, we can't really trust people with that land because, well, that's not the point. The point is that they should be able to do what they want with it. And I think it's really interesting when we come back to like conservation and earlier and rewilding, that land ownership is a part of that as well. So a lot, for me, something that's, I think, a really great example, or not a good example of this, is the Brewdog Forest in Aviemore, where they purchased an estate and were given an initial sum of £700,000 from taxpayers' money to rewild the land, and half of the forest died. Half of the saplings didn't grow, and rather than that being a lesson, the government gave them more money. I think it's been a total of £1.5 million to regenerative forests, and then now Brewdog just sold the estate. So now there's a question of, well, how are we going to get the money back? So again, there's an outsourcing of responsibility of, how does the commercialization and private companies and corporations play into our landscapes and natural environment and that stewardship as well.
Constantly and hugely all the time. Yeah, definitely. I was going to mention before we just hand out for questions, I was going to mention an example of, I guess, a group that would be great if people could check out. So Climate Camp Scotland, a couple of years ago, set up in Aberdeen and was invited to Aberdeen by a local activist group called Friends of St Fiddick's Park. So St Fiddick's Park is the last accessible green space in Tory, which is a historically deprived area of Aberdeen. The whole community has been hugely impacted by the oil industry, both in terms of health, but also because Old Tory was demolished because of the expansion of the harbour in the 1960s and 70s. So what's happening is that the council just a couple of days ago actually accepted and granted the permission to build a so-called energy transition zone in St Fiddick's Park. What this means, which sounds very nice, energy transition zone, we all want energy transition, don't we? Is that it leaves the power and the ownership of the land still with the oil industry, essentially, and the same people who have extracted and have been destroying these communities for decades. And I also think it's kind of a powerful example of what we've been talking about all this time in terms of that, like the very complex web of responsibility and whose job is it to show up in this case and to do that fight. It's not necessarily just the people of Tory and who live on that doorstep. It's also like the oil industry is currently killing people in Colombia and in Tanzania and in Uganda and obviously driving the climate crisis, which affects all of us. So, that was one example that I wanted to give. And Climate Camp Scotland is currently calling for direct action on this because it's a matter of days. So please go on to climatecamp.scot and join in that if you can. We're going to hand out the microphone for questions because we've got a few minutes left for that. So Mairi has got a microphone. If you've been sitting on a question, please raise your hand and Mairi will come to you.
Yeah. And just a wee heads up, because we've only got 5 minutes, a question is a single sentence with a question mark at the end. We can chat afterwards, but if we keep the questions short, we'll get more of them.
You had to tell me that now. I just want to say that I'm also a policy professional, and so this sort of question that you had about knowledge and sort of, you were decolonizing knowledge and space, but I wanted to ask, because you were advocating for lived experience, I've spent a lot of time sort of advocating for people to follow science and to do that more. How do you acquaint, people that often use lived experience to advocate for anti-climate, sort of potentially racist positions, when a lot of the sort of science that we want to be pushing onto people is helping to break that? And how do you balance both these positions?
Well, I think lived experience also means looking at different types of experience, which isn't just a qualification from a university. So I think that can present itself in lots of different ways. And I don't necessarily think that someone with lived experience might be a climate denier any more than someone who might work in that field can have opposing and different views as well. So I don't know if that maybe answers or doesn't answer your question.
Do we have another burning question? Yes, one on the end. It might not come all the way round, so I might need you to come down. It's just because anyone on the live stream won't hear, and our stage might not hear it either.
Okay, there we go. Thanks. Hi. This might be more of a personal question. I work in the conservation sector as well, and I work in a company that works with communities in the global south, and I'm from India, and you mentioned how you do struggle or did struggle working in majority white heteronormative companies or with these kind of organizations. And I find myself getting frustrated quite a bit or but getting burnt out quite a bit. How do you deal with that? Because I wonder that as well. That's my question. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the actual answer was I dealt with that by leaving, which is not helpful. But the better answer would be to, I guess, find spaces outside of your particular workplace, because there are lots of other people who are doing this work in at grassroots level, community groups who, you can find your people and share those experiences there, especially in terms of building resilience and improving your mental health as well. So I find that really crucial.
So one final burning question. Yes, up at the back. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for the brilliant conversation. I have a question about everybody's favourite local asset manager, Baillie Gifford. They are also quite active in the conservation space, and I'm wondering what advice you might give to people working in conservation who want to get rid of them.
Is this the same answer maybe apply in terms of joining other workers and movements that can, as a collective, you can help sort of fight against that investment in fossil fuels. So depending on where you work, there's lots of different places that will, like for fossil-free books, if you work in the books industry, are also fighting for that. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm just laughing because it's Baillie Gifford, but I would totally agree. I think so much of this really comes down to like the fighting where you are, fighting where you stand, whether that is in terms of physical place and community, or also in terms of in what industry do you have leverage? Because, when it comes to a lot of these companies and what they try to do in terms of bettering their image, they rely on worker compliance. They rely on us who work in these industries being okay with that and contributing with our labor. So withdrawing that, or at least organizing with fellow workers, is hugely powerful, whether that be in the conservation industry or the conservation space or in the literary industry.
Yeah, there's lots of different, I think, check out your unions, because many unions are taking an explicit stance on climate justice issues and on Palestine. So it would depend on which industry you work in.
Yeah. I was going to try and not end this talk with John, your union, but there you go.
Yeah.
We will have a wee signing table where you can come up and speak to our writers. We have, unfortunately, run out of copies, or we might have one. People were very eager with the zine of Decolonizing the Outdoors, but it is available directly from the Decolonizing the Outdoors website as well, so you can support Aileen directly and order it there, which I think leaves us only to say a very big thank you to you both. Thank you for being here, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Order the zine. It's wonderful.
And Jess's book.
Let's do that.